Abelard and Heloise, Love, Logic, and Tragedy. The story of Peter Abelard and Heloise is one of the most famous and tragic romances in history, a saga that intertwines brilliant intellect with profound human passion. In the early 12th century, Paris was the intellectual capital of Europe, and Abelard was its brightest star, a charismatic and controversial logician who attracted students from across the continent. Heloise was his student, a young woman of exceptional intelligence and learning. Their relationship was initially intellectual, but it blossomed into a passionate and secret affair. Heloise became pregnant, and they were secretly married. When Heloise's uncle, Fulbert, discovered their secret, he reacted with a savage act of revenge, hiring men to castrate Abelard. The tragedy did not end there. Humiliated, Abelard became a monk, and he compelled Heloise to become a nun. However, their story transcended this personal tragedy. Through a series of poignant and eloquent letters, they continued their relationship, exchanging profound philosophical and theological reflections on love, faith, sin, and redemption. Their correspondence offers a unique glimpse into the moral and spiritual struggles of two brilliant minds, and is a testament to a love that endured through immense suffering. Their story is a powerful reminder that Abelard's life was not just one of abstract logic and philosophy, but one deeply rooted in the messy and tragic realities of human existence. I understand in order to believe. Abelard's rational theology. Peter Abelard's theological approach is famously summarized by his motto, Intellego ut credam, or I understand in order to believe. This phrase represents a subtle but significant shift from the more famous motto of his predecessor, Saint Anselm, who said, I believe in order to understand. While Anselm used reason to explore and deepen the truths he already accepted by faith, Abelard was more radical. He believed that the first step was to subject the tenets of faith to a rigorous rational inquiry. He argued that it was not only permissible, but necessary for a Christian to use reason to clarify and validate their beliefs. Abelard believed that a faith that could not withstand rational scrutiny was a weak faith. His approach was to take a sacred doctrine, such as the Trinity, and use logic and dialectic to examine its components, to show its internal consistency, and to demonstrate why it was a rational and defensible belief. He was not trying to replace faith with reason, but to show that faith was the most reasonable position one could hold. This was a bold and controversial stance in an age where many theologians cautioned against using reason in matters of faith, fearing it could lead to heresy. Abelard's rational theology was a pioneering effort to create a systematic and logically consistent body of Christian thought, and it laid the methodological groundwork for the later flourishing of scholasticism. Ethics and intention. Abelard's moral philosophy. Peter Abelard is a foundational figure in the history of ethics, thanks to his groundbreaking moral philosophy, which placed intention at the very center of moral analysis. In his work Ethica, also known as Scito Taesuum, Know Thyself, Abelard challenged the prevailing ethical theories of his time, which often focused on the act itself. He argued that the moral quality of an action, whether it is good or evil, lies not in the act itself, but in the intention of the person performing it. For Abelard, sin is not the external act, but the internal consent to evil. An act such as killing is not inherently evil. It can be a sin if it is done with malicious intent, but it can be a moral act if it is done with a good intent, for example, in self-defense or in a just war. Abelard believed that the intention is what God sees and judges. He argued that an external act, such as giving to charity, might be morally neutral if it is done for a selfish motive, such as to gain public praise. Conversely, a person who intends to steal but is prevented from doing so has already sinned in their heart. This emphasis on the primacy of the inner moral state was a revolutionary concept that had a profound influence on later ethical theories. Abelard's moral philosophy provided a more nuanced and psychologically sophisticated understanding of sin and virtue, and it remains a cornerstone of intentionalist ethics to this day. Logic and language. Abelard's innovations. Peter Abelard was not just a theologian. He was, first and foremost, a logician whose innovations in logic and language transformed medieval thought. He was a master of dialectic, the art of logical debate and inquiry, and his teaching method was revolutionary. He would pose a question, present contradictory arguments from different authorities, sic et non, yes and no, and then use logical reasoning to resolve the conflict. This method became the standard for scholastic inquiry for centuries. His most significant contributions were in the philosophy of language and the problem of universals. Abelard's logical works, such as Dialectica and Logica Ingrediendibus, became standard textbooks for generations. He distinguished between the spoken word, the concept in the mind, and the external reality, providing a sophisticated semantic theory that anticipated later developments in philosophy of language. He was particularly influential in his analysis of predication and his critique of the prevailing theories of universals. His work on logic was not a dry academic exercise. For Abelard, logic was the indispensable tool for all philosophical and theological inquiry, a science of all sciences that could be used to clarify ambiguous doctrines and to expose contradictions in arguments. His innovations made logic the central discipline of medieval education and philosophy. Heretic or hero? Abelard's controversial legacy. Peter Abelard's life was a constant struggle against a powerful and conservative ecclesiastical establishment, a fact that has led to his legacy being viewed as both a heretic and a hero. To his detractors, most famously Bernard of Clairvaux, he was a dangerous intellectual who used reason to undermine the mysteries of faith. A new Arius who was leading students astray with his logical tricks and rationalist heresies. Bernard, a mystic and a staunch defender of orthodoxy, saw Abelard's emphasis on reason as an attack on the humility and spiritual purity of faith. He accused Abelard of rationalizing the Trinity and other sacred doctrines, leading to Abelard's condemnation at the Council of Sens in 1141. To his admirers, however, Abelard was a hero and a courageous intellectual pioneer. He was one of the first thinkers to champion the use of reason in theology, to question the unquestioned authority of tradition, and to insist on the right of the individual mind to seek understanding. His bold approach to ethics, his groundbreaking logical innovations, and his role in creating a new pedagogical method were all seen as heroic acts in the face of institutional inertia. His students, who were devoted to him, saw him as a master who taught them not what to think, but how to think. The debate over Abelard's legacy continues to this day, with some seeing him as a harbinger of the modern age, and others as a cautionary tale of an over-reliance on human intellect. Scholasticism begins. Abelard's role in medieval thought. Peter Abelard is rightly considered a pivotal figure in the birth of scholasticism, the dominant philosophical and theological tradition of the High Middle Ages. While scholasticism would reach its full maturity in the 13th century with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, Abelard laid the essential groundwork and methodology. He was a teacher whose innovative pedagogical methods and intellectual approach transformed the schools of Paris, which would eventually evolve into the first universities. The core of Abelard's scholastic method was his use of dialectic to explore theological questions. In his work, Sic et Non, Yes and No, he presented a series of theological questions, and then listed contradictory quotes on each topic from various respected authorities, such as the Church Fathers. His purpose was not to create doubt, but to show that these contradictions needed to be resolved through logical inquiry. This method of pro and con became the standard for scholastic inquiry. Furthermore, Abelard's emphasis on clear, systematic reasoning, his precise use of logical categories, and his belief that reason was a necessary tool for understanding faith became the defining characteristics of scholasticism. He created the intellectual climate and the methodological tools that would allow later scholastic masters to build their vast and intricate philosophical syntheses.
The legacy of Anselm in Christian philosophy. The legacy of Saint Anselm in Christian philosophy is immense and enduring. He is widely considered one of the founders of scholasticism, the dominant philosophical tradition in medieval Europe. His famous phrase, "Faith seeking understanding," became the motto and the methodological blueprint for 1,000 years of theological and philosophical inquiry. Anselm's work demonstrated that theology could be done with the same intellectual rigor and logical precision as other philosophical disciplines. His specific contributions have continued to be a source of debate and inspiration. The ontological argument has been a recurring theme in philosophical history, inspiring later thinkers like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, and it continues to be discussed in philosophy departments today. His satisfaction theory of the atonement became the cornerstone of Western Christian soteriology, shaping the theology of the Catholic, Protestant, and Anglican traditions. By providing a logical, reasoned, and systematic framework for understanding Christian doctrines, Anselm elevated the status of theology and laid the groundwork for the great scholastic syntheses of Thomas Aquinas and others. His writings showed that a deep faith and a powerful intellect were not mutually exclusive, but were, in fact, the two wings on which the human mind could soar towards God.
God's existence, Anselm's logical proof. Anselm's argument for God's existence, as laid out in his Proslogion, is a purely logical proof that begins with the very idea of God. The argument, also known as the ontological argument, is not based on empirical evidence, but on a clever and intricate line of reasoning. Anselm starts with the definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. This premise is crucial, as it is a definition that he believes even a skeptic can understand. He then proceeds to argue that this being must exist in reality. The argument is as follows. We have the concept of God in our minds, defined as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Something that exists in reality is greater than something that exists only as an idea in the mind. If God existed only as an idea, then we could conceive of a greater being, namely, one that also exists in reality. The tragic genius of the 12th century. Peter Abelard was the quintessential tragic genius of the 12th century. His life was a dramatic interplay of extraordinary intellectual brilliance and immense personal suffering. Born into a lesser noble family in Brittany, he chose a life of scholarship and quickly rose to intellectual stardom, challenging and surpassing his teachers with his sharp mind and rhetorical skill. His charisma and intellectual power made him a celebrity, and students flocked to hear him lecture in Paris. However, his personal life was a series of profound tragedies. His scandalous affair with Heloise, a relationship that began as a teacher-student dynamic, led to his castration and the end of his career as a public teacher in Paris. This personal humiliation was compounded by his constant theological battles. He was a controversial figure who was repeatedly condemned as a heretic by ecclesiastical councils, often on the instigation of his powerful rival, Bernard of Clairvaux. Abelard spent his later years in monastic seclusion, teaching and writing, but his intellectual courage and his personal life had made him a pariah. Despite the immense suffering, he never abandoned his commitment to reason, and his greatest works were often written during these periods of exile and persecution. The story of Abelard is a poignant reminder that intellectual genius is not always a path to worldly success or happiness, but can also be a source of immense conflict and pain. Reason in the Age of Faith. Abelard's contribution. The 12th century was an age of faith, where religious authority and tradition were often considered the ultimate sources of truth. In this context, Peter Abelard's singular contribution was his unwavering commitment to reason. While his contemporaries often used reason to confirm faith, Abelard was a pioneer in using reason to explore, question, and clarify faith. He believed that faith was not a blind leap into the unknown, but a rational and defensible act. His work was a testament to his belief that God, as the ultimate source of all reason, could not have created a world where religious truth was illogical or contradictory. He saw the task of the theologian as using the tools of logic to make the truths of faith intelligible. In his work, Sic et Non, he presented theological contradictions not as a cause for doubt, but as an intellectual puzzle to be solved. His method taught an entire generation of scholars that it was not an act of blasphemy to ask questions of faith, but an act of intellectual piety. Abelard's contribution was to lay the groundwork for a new intellectual era where faith and reason were seen as partners in the search for truth, a partnership that would define the scholastic tradition and profoundly shape Western thought for centuries to come.